history librarian at Jeffersonville Township Public Library. And I'm here today with Kathy Fisher, who serves in the same role at Harrison County Public Libraries. And we did have Melissa Wiseheart, who is in the same role at, and there she comes back, at Floyd County Public Library. And we have once before done this program, but I think we probably all mixed it up a little bit. So we have some different women. But since this year is the 120th anniversary of the women getting the vote, the suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment, we thought we would honor women ancestors of our counties in particular by coming up with some particularly brave, rough, tough women from our past and giving them each a few minutes of your time so you can hear about these ladies. Does everybody hear me all right? I see a few really puzzled faces. So, okay, good. I'm glad to hear it. If you have trouble, please let me know. I need to make an adjustment there. And looks like we are recording. So I believe we're going to go in the order of Melissa from Floyd County first. So this is Melissa Wiseheart, and she will be talking about Floyd County women. I don't know if we should call them ladies. I guess we'll have to find out what she presents. So kind of hope they're not. And are you ready? Are you able to chime in now, Melissa?
Yes, I think. Can you guys hear me?
I can't hear you.
Okay. Let me see if this helps. Okay. Can everybody hear me now?
I can hear you now. It just looks like your network is kind of dropping.
Yeah, so I dropped my signal a few minutes ago, and I'm not really sure. Our internet has been crazy spotty for the last week since they supposedly fixed it. So
fixes are always bad. Well, you should have screen sharing now. So
okay. Okay, let me see if I can get to my. Well, for Pete's sake. Okay, there's my desktop. So Mary Ann is the person that I talked about when we did, well, I guess it was 2019, goodness. Oh no, it was earlier this year, sorry.
It's been a long year.
A long year, guys. Okay, now let me minimize that. Okay, so Mary Ann Silliman, Ayers, Lindsley, Richardson, Lapsley is a mouthful. Been called New Albany's Siren, the Femme Fatale, the Black Widow of New Albany, and her spook. So a little bit of background on the Sillimans. William and Phoebe were her parents. They moved to New Albany from Connecticut in about 1816. And the family included Mary Ann, her sisters Catherine and Martha Ann, and her brother-in-law Daniel Banks. William and Phoebe both died of typhoid fever in October 1816, just 1 week apart from each other. And William was 60, Phoebe was 53. They are both buried in Fairview Cemetery. Mary Ann went to live with her brother-in-law and her sister, Dr. Daniel Chapman Banks and Martha Ann Silliman Banks, at Mr. Cuthbert Bullitt's house in Louisville. Mary Ann taught school in Louisville. So husband number one was Elias Ayers, and she worked closely with him in his business. They were married on July 27th, 1819 in Louisville. She was 23 and he was 27. They lived there for a couple years and then they moved to New Albany. Elias was a merchant and a dealer and shipper of produce. And he supported the building of the first turnpike in Indiana and all the New Albany and Salem Railroad. They were devout Unitarians, and they financially contributed to the formation of New Albany Theological Seminary and continued to give funds to that school. They had 8 children together and outlived all 8 of their children. Elias died January 5th, 1842 at the age of 50. And I also want to note that in 1824, Mary Ann's sister Catherine married a James Hillier. So these are the Ayers children. We have Mary B., who died at the age of 19 from hydrocephalus. We have William Silliman Ayers, who died at age 7. Edward Elias Ayers, who died at age 15. Caroline Hillier Ayers, age 2.5. Henry A., age 20 months. Carolyn Silliman Ayers, age 4. Cornelia Anna, age 16 months, who also died of hydrocephalus. And Maria Catherine, age 20 months. So one of the things to note here is that Mary Ann lost a lot of her children around the same time. In 1929, we had William and Caroline H., who both died, and then Henry died the following year. Then in 1834, we had Caroline S. and Cornelia both die. And then in 1839, Mary and Edward both died. And so as 2 of the children died of hydrocephalus, which is also known as water on the brain. And they still don't really know what causes hydrocephalus, but there's a possibility that it's genetic. And with that in mind, it makes me think that possibly a lot of the other children died from the same thing. Unfortunately, most of their deaths occurred before death records were required in Indiana, so I don't have any way of proving that. Mary Ann's sister Catherine also died in 1836 at the age of 30, and then her brother-in-law Daniel died in 1844. Her sister Martha died in 1848. I don't have a cause of death for any of them, but I'm not living with them at the time. And that's important to note because a lot of people speculate that she killed her children, her 4 husbands, of her family members. But it's more probable that she just was a very unlucky person and everyone she ever knew and loved died. And what kind of adds fuel to the fire in the story of her being a murdering Black Widow is that there were rumors circulating that perhaps she and Epaphras Jones were an item. And these rumors started with this picture. He left this to her with an inscription. This picture to Mrs. Mary Ann Ayers as a memento of friendship of men understanding, Christian love and regard, to be received by her at my. And this was even fueled by a marriage record of 1822. Epaphras Jones married a Mary Ann Silliman. So this might be what people thought was the motive for her to have murdered her husband Elias, but it's just not true. Our Mary Ann, at the time of Epaphras' marriage, married to Elias Ayers, and this Mary Ann was probably a relative. The Sillimans lived in Connecticut. The men all served in the military. Epaphras Jones, who was also from Connecticut, also served in the military and had likely known the Silliman family for a number of years. So now we get to husband 2, the Reverend Dr. Phillip Lindsley. They were married April 19th, 1849. Philip was chancellor of the University of Nashville, Tennessee, and they lived in Nashville for a little while before they moved back to New Albany. Philip taught at New Albany Theological Seminary for 2 years, and that's the school that Mary Ann and Elias had funded. And then Philip died as a result of a brain hemorrhage on May 25th, 1855 in Nashville. He was away at a Presbyterian conference, and Mary Ann was nowhere near him, so she did not kill him. In 1850, Mary Ann owned no property. Her husband owned $85,000 of real estate. Without his will, it's difficult to tell what Mary Ann inherited from Elias, but some of it probably was also hers from her family settlement. But in any case, Mary Ann began to buy and sell property and in banking business on her own account. So that in 1860, she had $100,000 worth of real estate and $100,000 of personal property. Her second husband, Reverend Dr. Lindsley, owned $50,000 of real estate and $90,000 of personal property. Husband number 3 is Wilson. They were married in April of 1857. William was the president of the Northern Bank of Kentucky, and they lived in Louisville for a little while. William died on January 23rd, 1863, and Mary Ann moved back to New Albany at that point in time. In 1870, Mary Ann owned $100,000 of real estate and $100,000 of personal estate. And at that time, who was Reverend Robert Armstrong Lapsley, had no. They were married February 6th, 1866 in New Albany. Robert and Mary Ann lived there, and he was a Presbyterian minister. Robert died on February 13th, 1872 at the age of 74. So based on the tax list of 75, she was not only the richest woman in New Albany, she was the third richest person in New Albany, W.C. DePaul and W.S. Culbertson, which are names that most of us probably are familiar with. In 1876, she was the owner of the Schmidt Furniture Building, the Woolen Mill, and the John B. Ford Glass Works. In 1878, at the time of her death, her personal property was worth $260,465.65. Her total property was $328,405.65. While she was living, she was a benefactor to many charities and served as president of the Ladies' Benevolence Society. After her benevolence continued in the form of bequests to various Presbyterian agencies and villages. Her ghost was also sighted about a week after she died. A lot of people thought that she came back to kill off whoever remained of her family. But the ghost didn't stay around very long, and no one saw hide or hair of her after that. So a lot of people still maintain that she plotted to kill her entire family, but I believe that she was just very misunderstood and had an unfortunate and tragic life.
Well,
and then I do have one more short story here. So this is from my own research. And Sarah Jane Baker is not a relative of mine, but John Bridges is a relative of mine, and he was involved in a murder trial. Those are always fun. And then people say to me that they're afraid of finding skeletons in their closet when they do their genealogy, but that's one of my favorite things to find because they end up in the paper and then you find out a lot of things about them. Murder trial, John Bridges was charged with killing a German man named Baker. And this was supposedly because John Bridges gave him a dog, asked for $1 as payment for the dog, and was only paid 75 cents. So he felt he was owed a quarter and went to a bar, had a few drinks, and then decided to confront him for the quarter. And it did not end well. But the reason that I highlight this trial is because the testimony of Sarah Jane Baker here, who says that it was premeditated, that John Bridges came over specifically to kill her husband, first of all, for the quarter that he was owed. But secondly, because supposedly John Bridges was married, and though she was married, was very much in love with her and had intended to abscond with her. And that's why he came armed with a knife. So then we have Margaret, who is a character witness for Sarah Jane Baker, trying to corroborate her story there, talking about how she heard people say that John Bridges went to the Baker house with a knife with the intent of killing Mr. Baker. And that one of the people that said that was John Bridges' stepson. And here's where the fun begins. So these are the character witnesses for the defense, and all of the people here have John S. Davis, Alexander Dowling, who was a judge, John Underhill, Reed, E.L. Pennington, who was an inventor in New Albany. Lots of people here, all saying that Sarah Jane Baker's testimony can't be trusted because she's a woman of ill repute who hangs out with prostitutes. She's a known liar. And that Margaret Hitchcock also can't be trusted because she also is a bad and mean person. So it's interesting to read all of these character statements, and also interesting to think how your ancestor's reputation could end up in the newspaper. And then, for those of you curious, the conclusion of this was that he was charged with murder in the second degree. It was not premeditated. He was sentenced to prison for life, but he did get out after 14 years on good behavior. Well, now if I can figure out how to get that up. Okay, there we go. All right, and I think that wraps it up for me. But are there any questions about Mary Ann or about the Bridges murder trial?
Pretty fun.
Yeah. Okay, I think Kathy is next. Is that right?
I hope so.
Sure, why not? Okay. So let's see if I can figure this out. You know, I've attended plenty of these, but actually doing something during a program is a little bit new. So let's see if I can figure out how to get this to work.
Got it.
All right. There we go. So when I was first approached by Diane about doing this program, it actually had a different title. We were toying around with nasty women, and of course that just conjures up thoughts of murderers and bank robbers. So like find the Harrison County Lizzie Borden or Bonnie Parker. Sure. But in my mind, I was more hooked on the context of the phrase, kind of searching for the fierce, strong women who were trying to buck the system during hardships and yet still thriving. Especially with this being the centennial of women's suffrage. Of course, quite unfortunately, this commemoration has been greatly diminished with life such as it is in 2020. But I think if you poke around a little bit, you could still find, some events mostly, online like this one. Anyway, but that's kind of the more dangerous type of woman that I had in my head. Harrison County certainly has plenty of these strong, fierce, notable ladies within its history. That's not to say that we don't have any of the other sort of notorious character, but I think for today I'm gonna keep things a bit more positive. I think we could all use a little bit of that. That being said, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention perhaps the best example of a strong, resourceful, fierce woman from the beginning of Harrison County, and that's Elizabeth English Pennington. Elizabeth was born about 1783 to William and Catherine Patterson English on the frontier of what would become Bean Station, Tennessee. 4 years later, the family homestead is raided by hostile Native Americans. Her father and aunt are killed. And Elizabeth and her mother and her brother and 2 sisters are taken captive and then split apart. One by one, the other family members escape or get rescued. But it takes about 10 years to track down Elizabeth, who's being raised by an Indigenous couple who, by all accounts, raised her, well, as they would her, she was their own child. But yeah, after living with this time with the Native Americans, basically her formative years, if you do the math, she's going to be about 14 when she's brought back into white life. And she has to relearn, everything from speaking English to, how to dress properly, cooking, and, so forth. And, from that point on, education becomes a great motivator in her life. Elizabeth meets Dennis Pennington. They fall in love, marry, and as was the norm, they start having children soon thereafter. The couple and at least one child moved to Indiana and settled just north of Corydon in 1804. Now, in order to really hit home on Elizabeth's importance, I do need to take some time to talk about Dennis for a minute. Upon his settlement into Indiana Territory, he's thrust into politics. He won his first election to serve as a Harrison County representative in the territorial government in 1809. And the next year, he takes over the role of Speaker of the Territorial House, and he would go on to serve as a delegate to the State Constitutional Convention, and so on and so forth. So education, education, education. In addition to being a statesman, Dennis taught all of his own children, and before all is said and done, we're talking about a dozen. And he also taught many of the neighborhood children. At first, there was a penny charge for these other children to attend, but when it became obvious that money was an obstacle for these other families, Elizabeth stepped in and convinced Dennis to never mind the penny and educate the children for free. As the newly formed State Constitutional Convention was convening in the summer of 1816, the issue of educating children throughout the new state came up. Dennis came home, proudly announced that he had negotiated education be free for all of the children of landowners. Well, Elizabeth promptly told him to make it free for all of the children, or he needn't come home again. So, as a result of the Pennington's push, Section 2 of Article 9 of the 1816 Constitution provided that Indiana become the first state in the Union to offer education for free. And that's for all, and that's township school up to the university level. Putting this into practice wasn't instantaneous or easy, of course, but we'll just keep that in mind. So in general, Elizabeth was a big supporter of Dennis and all of his endeavors, even if that meant occasionally setting him straight on what those endeavors really should be. She was very opinionated, and on occasions that she became angry, she would revert to using the indigenous language that she had grown up learning. And even if her time in captivity might be seen overall as a positive one, or at least not as traumatic as other stories that you've heard, it was no less of an experience, and it certainly helped shape her life. And you might argue it helped shape the way of early Indiana. So I've got this coin on the screen right now, and it's a great analogy. So I'm gonna flip it and change directions completely. So let's skip ahead. Welcome to the 20th century. Clara Habermill. She became the first woman to formally practice medicine in Harrison County. And she earned her doctor title studying medicine in Louisville. And then she started up a practice in Bradford, which is in the northern part of the county. Her style was based on the homeopathic school of medicine, and she often incorporated herbal solutions into her care. In 1902, she opened a sanitarium for tuberculosis in cancer patients in Corydon, and even developed a salve for skin cancer. Although she was popular, her medical skill did not come without scrutiny. At least once, she was taken to court by another county physician for removing a quarantine flag. Now, the two of them argued over the diagnosis of a child. Dr. Davis claimed diphtheria, which would have warranted having the county health officer, Dr. Funk, to put up a quarantine. Dr. Habermel claimed it was croup, which would not have warranted a quarantine. The two diseases are similar. In fact, another name for diphtheria is membranous croup. But as far as I can tell, and I'm certainly not up on medical terminology, it's certainly a lesser form and not as dangerous as regular croup, which is the kind that Clara was claiming. The child died. One obituary named membranous croup as the cause of death. Dr. Habermel herself signed the death certificate naming croup as the primary cause. Ultimately, the lawsuits dropped, not having anything to do with the diagnosis or the dead child, but simply because they couldn't prove that Clara was the person who actually removed the quarantine flag. So, Dr. Habermel continued to practice medicine up into the 1920s when her own health began to fade. She died in 1929 and was buried in Bradford, back where it all started. Now, earlier I gave a little shout out to the suffrage movement. So did Diane. And while the fight for women's right to vote raged all over the nation, for the most part, neither of Corydon's newspapers really paid much attention. Other than a report just kind of how it was going through the state legislature. They didn't seem to push for suffrage, nor did they really seem to, push for repressing the vote either. But of course, in full view, you got to realize at the same time, you've got prohibition, this little flu pandemic floating around, the threat of being dragged into a little war in Europe, that those bigger things just took up more print. Whether or not it was completely true, Corydon did try to sound like it was ahead of the curve, and it does have at least one direct claim to the suffrage movement in Indiana. Julia Freed literally grew up under the branches of the Constitution elm in the Westfall House. And this is known as Corydon's oldest residence, and it literally sits behind the tree. If you go and see the stump, as they call it, you can see this house right behind it. She graduated from Corydon High School in 1894, and she went on to teach in several of the rural one-room schoolhouses throughout the county. She eventually moves to Indianapolis, and she became a staunch supporter of education and suffrage, became a well-known lecturer throughout the state. In 1906, she married John Walker, who was editor of the Educator Journal, and she served as editor of the publication's primary school department. So in addition, she also held prestigious positions in the Franchise League of Indiana, the Legislative Council of Indiana Women, and the Indiana State Teachers Association. Following her husband's death, Julia Freed Walker succeeded him as the full editor and publisher of the journal. She also served as the national president of the Organization of Educational Publications. That's a mouthful. Tragically, Julia died in 1917 at the age of only 41. Now, a quirky thing about Indiana suffrage is that that same year, women were briefly granted the right to register to vote for some of the lower ballot races. Unfortunately, that was taken back away before any elections could actually take place. But one could still hold out hope that Julia's name appears on a 1917 voter registration list somewhere up in Marion County. So, education. I think if I accidentally had a sub theme for today, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be education, right? So, keeping with that theme, strong-minded educators. So the last female that I want to profile today, let's flip that coin back around. I have to first go back a few steps to the beginnings of Harrison County. Despite the, shall we say, complicated relationship that Indiana had with enslaved or indentured people, even though the law said slavery was illegal, there were loopholes all over the place. Most indentured people had to sue for their freedom and so on and so forth. The laws here were still better than other states. That was attractive enough for one particular abolitionist family. Around 1814, Paul and Susanna Mitchum, along with over 100 slaves, made their way to Harrison County. Rather piecemeal, these Blacks are freed, a few here, a few there, until Paul's death, when it fell upon Susanna to actually finish this dream of freeing everyone. She ends up being the one to formally file the last of the manumission paperwork. So we'll call Susanna a bonus notable. Many descendants of these freed African Americans would go on to be very influential in the county. And one such is Leora Brown Farrow. Now, remember, I mentioned earlier that the implementation of Article 9 was not perfect or instantaneous. It actually took 11 years before the first public school opened in Harrison County. And most likely this was exclusive for the white children. Education for African American children in Corydon initially began within the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It wasn't until 1851 when the church built a building that to be used for both a church and a school. The parsonage was also doubled as a school until 1891, when a separate exclusive school building was finally built on Summit Street, and originally known as the Corydon Colored School. This one-story frame building served as both the grade and high school for Corydon's Black students. The high school held its first commencement in May of 1897 with 4 graduates. Leora Brown was a 1923 graduate of the school, and she went right on to continue her education at Miss Blaker's Teacher College in Indianapolis. This is notable because that event evolved into Butler University. So Leora returned to Corydon to teach at the colored school for 26 years. And this is longer than anyone else. And so we're up to 1950, when the school was closed and the students were all integrated into Corydon Central. Rather short-sightedly, Leora was not offered a job within this integrated system. Despite this, she no doubt affected the lives of every student she was able to reach, most of whom could trace their ancestry right directly back to this freed Mitcham enclave. By all accounts, she was an inspiring educator, enabling her pupils to achieve their dreams beyond just learning the 3 R's. In honor of its well-known, longest tenured educator, the Corydon Colored School was restored as a historic site and renamed the Leora Brown School. And today it represents one of the best examples of an African-American school in the state of Indiana. Okay, so my family tree is full of strong women, many of them involved in the education system in some form or another, many of them, enduring hardships, including, and I hope this comes through up at the top, is the name Elizabeth. So I'm going to bring you full circle. That is Elizabeth Pennington, and I'm proud to say that I descend from her. So and now I invite all of you to take a look at your own family trees and find your own notable women within its branches. Oh, there we go. Whew. That's me. Anybody has any questions? Or feel free to send me an email.
Oh. Very good. Are we all ready for me to try to share my screen now, or does anybody have questions for Kathy? Or okay, absolute silence. All right. Well, when we did this in the winter last year, I kind of focused on alarming stories, women who had not stuck to the usual pattern, the expected stereotype for the meek 19th century women, or even I think I went back to several centuries with one group, one family, but and I picked some pretty nasty girls, some people who had been accused of witchcraft and other really alarming things. But this time I looked more at people who were courageous in seeking freedom and safety for their families, and for other in civil rights for those that they knew. And I guess we'll get started. So I left up the nasty women, rough, tough, and often dangerous female ancestors of Clark County residents. I think at least one of mine, even though she lived a pretty tame life by modern standards, would probably be wearing a t-shirt today that called her, that said nasty women or nasty woman on it, because that's the kind of girl she was. She would have been proud to be called nasty if it got attention to her cause. But the first woman I want to look at is Mollie or Mary Denning, and both her first name and her last name had various spellings. And you're going to hear a lot more about her and her family very soon, because an award-winning author has written a book about them, and it is due out in January. It is called A Shot in the Moonlight. You'll find out why it's called that in a moment. So one winter night in 1897, a Ku Klux Klan mob forced the formerly enslaved Mollie Denning and her children to abandon their farm in Simpson County, Kentucky, ill-clad and barefoot. Now, they had nice clothes. They had shoes. The Klan forced them out without anything. I will talk more about that in a minute. But at that time, George Denning, Mollie's husband, was in prison because this was the second attack. In the first attack, the Klan had fired on the family. Bullets had sailed very near their children. I hope that when the book comes out, I can determine from the additional research done by the writer, Ben Montgomery, exactly how many they have, but I have found records indicating there were anywhere from 10 to 20. There were 10 at home in the 1900 census. So they had a big family. George was hit, but he killed someone in the Klan. And after the second attack, Mollie feared to stay in Kentucky, and she led her 10 children to safety in Jeffersonville. So they just got across the river out of Kentucky, where they were far from the Simpson County Klan, and they stopped there, and they waited to see what would happen to George, and they never left. So during that earlier attack, George had killed not just a member, but one of the leaders, one of the richest men in that county. He was jailed for murder. He was not expected to be let loose. In fact, he was not expected to survive to trial. The Kentucky officials had to move him around a lot in order to keep him safe, because mobs kept attacking the jail. When the second Klan mob came to their farm, Mollie was the sole adult defending the children. So she had no choice to comply with them. There was no defending that many children with an armed mob. So she ran and abandoned their farm. They had a very successful tobacco farm, and that is the bottom line. That's the reason why they were under attack. The mob had set their sights upon getting the farm, and now that the land had been cleared and planted and things were going well and there were great outbuildings and a great house, they wanted it. They wanted to give it to one of their members or split it up among them. So they were successful in that, but they came to freedom in Clark County, and the mobs attacking George over and over again, and the subsequent trial where he was tried and convicted, but the Klansmen making the statements were contradicting themselves all over the place and exposing what they'd really done all the time. And it became very clear that the Klan had planned all this and had meant to throw him out of his house and steal it, and had not really cared what became of him or his children as they did so. And people became outraged. The outrage was national. The New York Times even ran an article about it. So the governor of Kentucky, who was a former abolitionist, and of course, slavery had been abolished, but he was sympathetic to the cause of African-American freedom, and he pardoned George when he learned about what was going on. George joined the family in Jeffersonville and swore with his wife that they would sue that mob for what they did. And both Mollie and George were illiterate, but they found someone to take the case. And in Louisville, in federal court, they sued. They won. They stayed in Jeffersonville during this entire time. In fact, for the rest of their lives. Their winnings totaled $50,000, which was a remarkable early civil rights victory, and is the main reason why they have attracted the attention of national authors. They are buried in Eastern Cemetery. We have not been able to locate George's grave. We hope he's somewhere close to Mollie. She is in the pauper section in Jeffersonville's Eastern Cemetery, and you can see her tombstone there. We have a record that indicates that he was buried at Eastern Cemetery too, but no stone and no record remains of the exact location of his burial. But they are remembered by many area descendants, and they're soon to be remembered by a book that I hope will be very, very well read. I'm pretty excited about it. Now, some of you are probably thinking, that's Sybil Ludington in the picture, and it is. I couldn't find a picture of Rachel Fleeheart, but Rachel Fleeheart was Clark County's Paul Revere. Her exploits took place in 1812 during the Pigeon Roost Massacre. A Native American war party came to Pigeon Roost, which is around the Clark County, Scott County line, and started attacking cabins there. Many people were killed. Families ran into the woods and tried to escape them, and some were successful, but quite a few people were burned in their homes or scalped. We don't know a whole lot about Rachel in her early life, at least. She was likely a sister to John Fleeheart and related to the Biggs and Sparks families of Old Clark County. Both families are still in this area. But she may have lived to be nearly 100. We're really not sure how old she was at the time when this happened in 1812, but we do have her obituary stating that she was almost 100 years old. So there's no certainty when she was born, because even though there's a death certificate, nobody would have known when she was born because there was no record of her birth. And I'm always skeptical of these people that say they lived to be 100 without any proof. So, but she could have been 100. It's possible. But according to the Evening News of July 17th, 1919, there were no men willing to leave the safety of Charlestown to alert settlers of the farmland along the Ohio when Charlestown received the news of the massacre. And people were just quaking in their boots. They thought that a war party might come to Charlestown. They didn't really know what the ultimate goal of this Native American war party was. And so everybody headed for the fortifications, but Miss Fleeheart was a little tougher. And to quote the paper, she procured a good horse and rode into the wilds. She stopped at every farmhouse she believed to be in danger, riding along the river from Charlestown to Utica. And William Henry Harrison called Fleeheart my little corporal, because she was so brave. William Henry Harrison was the governor of Indiana Territory. But later, people realized that the war party headed north while she rode to the farmhouses that were well south of Pigeon Roost. But I don't think that really changes the fact that she was pretty brave and pretty willing to protect those around her, even people that she must not have known very well. She rode out when no one else would. Her obituary noted that she was a talented lace maker, and because of her bravery, her family continued to preserve lace supposedly made by her hands. She just seems to have remained a spinster her entire life, but she certainly made quite an impression on her family and on many others. And my final person I'd like to talk about today is Mary Garrett Hay. And remember back at the beginning, I said that one of my ladies today would have been very proud to have a t-shirt that said nasty woman. I think Mary probably would have been right on with that if it would have gotten attention to her cause, because she was one of America's foremost feminists and suffragettes. She was born in Clark County in 1857. She attended the Presbyterian Church in Charlestown. Her father was a pharmacist and sent her to school too. Mary Garrett Hay became a pharmacist and worked in her father's pharmacy early in her life. But being a pharmacist was definitely not her goal in life. She was quite the queen of the feminist movement in the early period. Eventually, she moved to New York City, and her activism really took off once she moved there. She also was in California for a while, but she started out right here in Clark County. Here's a little bit of her resume. She was the president of the New York Equal Suffrage League, the president of the Daughters of Indiana, which was basically a social club for New Yorkers who came from Indiana, president, Women's Suffrage Party. And you see over to the side there is a collection of buttons and pins from the Women's Suffrage Party. Those were collected by the Indiana Archives. And she was chair of the Republican Women's National Executive Committee and president of the National League of Women Voters. She was out there organizing protests, organizing all kinds of civic education for women, citizenship classes for women, organizing women to vote together once the vote became possible. Organizing her party in order to, she became a Republican in order to get more people behind the vote for women. So she was of national prominence. After years of agitation, demonstration, and frustration, she and her housemate, Carrie Chapman Catt, with whom she lived in New York, went together to cast their first votes for president on November 2nd, 1920. So we just passed that anniversary of the first time women voted for president across this country. And Catt found Mary Garrett Hay dead on her birthday. Hay was upstairs getting ready for guests, and she had a heart attack and died. And it was on August 29th, 1928. So she did live to see her dreams come true. That's a picture of Catt to the side there. Catt remained in New York until her death in 1947. And she had a tombstone erected that bears both of their names, and they are buried side by side, and their headstone reads, "Here lie two, united in friendship for 38 years through constant service to a great cause." And of course, their great cause was feminism and the vote for women. So I have a whole bunch more women I could have talked about today, but I didn't want to drive anybody insane with historical detail, but that you can certainly learn more at the library. You'll be welcome anytime, and any of our 3 libraries. So see if I can get back. I hope that was entertaining and informative. Anybody have any questions for any of us? Thank you. I see really liked all 3 presentations. Oh, what's the name of the book? Shot in the Moonlight. I'll type it in. And Ben Montgomery is the author. And it's going to be at our library. We have it on order. Oh. I guess if there are no further questions, I guess it's nice to see you all. Thank you.
Good to see you guys.
So very good. I guess, can we stop the recording?